I'm Bill Streeter, and I operated what you call now the Old Creamery in the 1950s.
The Old Creamery is about to become a community-owned cooperative, and so at this historic juncture, we thought it'd be nice to talk with you, Bill, and get the history of this building, this business, how it began. Of course, your involvement as owner of it for nearly a decade in the 1950s. This business, this creamery, a lot of people don't even know what a creamery is today. They'll see the Old Creamery or Creamery Road in a small town, and they have no idea what life was like in the 19th century, why people would have something called a creamery. They might think of ice cream, for instance, but can you tell us a little bit about how this cooperative in the 1800s came to be?
Well, it actually was incorporated as a cooperative in 1886, and my family was very much a part of it. We were large farmers, and believe it or not, back in them days they considered wealthy farmers. Today you wouldn't with today's society, but they were, and they were very meticulous farmers, and they had what we call a cheese house on the farm, and they made a lot of cheese, and they sold a lot of butter and so on, and marketing it was the major problem. You had a surplus over what you could sell at your door or your family usage. You had to get it into buckets, wooden bucket, and ship it to Boston, and that was a chore in itself. Preserving it and how much salt to put in it so it would stay fresh all the way to Boston and so on. So they were eager to join a co-op in 1886. So my great-great-grandfather Henry Streeter and my great-great-uncle Charles Cotton Streeter were some of the first ones to promote and join the cooperative. Some of the members of the family were the secretary of the co-op and so on back there, and it was very successful. It's a story all into itself, how they preserved the milk and how they measured the milk and brought it into the creamery so every farmer got an equal share of what he shipped in. They also sold grain here at the creamery. So it was almost the center of, became the center of the town for the farmers when the creamery got going, and it had a tremendous reputation for shipping high quality, and that doesn't surprise me because them generations back there were very articulate and very precise in everything they did. Yeah. So it doesn't surprise me that it was so successful.
I read in one of the books you've written and published with the historical people in town, Only One Cummington, Volume 2, I read that the creamery, that individual farmers bringing their cream and milk here to be made into butter, it actually freed up the majority of time that farm wives in that time were tasked with making the butter themselves, and that also most farmers made more money by having this cooperative venture do it. You want to talk about that a little?
Well, I can surmise that it totally turned the task around on the farm. Instead of, I think particularly for women, we don't realize that up until about that time, in that period of time, and even later, the women did all the milking. The milkmaid, you know, the old poems about the milkmaid and so on. And the men were not good milkers. They were harsh at milking. They got the cows nervous, so on, and it wasn't very sanitary. The women were very clean at it, and it freed up the women. My great-great-grandfather's family had 11 children and mom in it, to what would have been my great-great-grandmother, And there's no doubt about it. They had to run it on a very disciplined basis. Every child had a chore, and you better darn well do it. And the girls probably done equally as much as the boys, particularly because we did have a separate building on the farm and for butter making and all of the byproducts. So my guess is that it was a great improvement on labor on the farm during that period and coming up out of that period.
Interesting. I did write down some figures from your book and one of the reports that are in it from the Cooperative Association of the time. Business was chartered here. The cooperative was chartered in 1886, and it states that it was up and running in regular operation by 1887. And in 1890, they reported that in the 4 years that it had been in operation, that they had produced 500,000 pounds of butter.
That's amazing.
Sold, and this is 19th century, sold for $106,260, $106,260, and they paid for the milk and the cream $88,997 in the first 4 years of operation.
Yeah.
It wasn't a small business.
That may not sound like a lot of money to people today, but when you stop and think that the yearly wages for a farm helper was $120, or you built and had a new home for $200 and $250. So when you talk $100,000, you're talking a tremendous amount of money.
Yes.
And yeah, so that was a lot of money back then.
At this cooperative, how far of a catchment area was there? How far?
Well, we reached out into Worthington, Goshen, Chesterfield, and Plainfield. I won't say there wasn't an occasional customer from Ashfield, but that's primarily where we reached out to. Windsor. Yeah. It's the one thing that was interested in the town of Cummington at that time, parallel to the Cummington Cooperative Creamery, was the agriculture fair, and that started in actually it started in 1860. They don't date themselves back only to 1868 because the Civil War butted in on them, and so they don't count them early years. But that was going full force at the same time, the creamery. So it was sort of an agricultural revolution taking place right here in Cummington, more so than we want to recognize because of the creamery and because of the fair and because of the amount of mowing machines that were being purchased and the hay rakes that were being purchased by the farmer and so on. I think in my book there I quote that back in 1832 we wasn't using the draft horse so much then. We were using pretty much oxen, and we numbered well over 65 yokes of mature oxen and another 65 yokes of young oxen in training. 1932, just 100 years later, there was not an ox on the books, the assessor's records. It was all horses, draft horses. So, and they were much faster, and it changed farming as much as the Cummington Cooperative Creamery or the Agriculture Fair. We had gone through our industrial revolution. Cummington has got a very unique history because we had one of the first cotton mills in the state of Massachusetts right here in Cummington. We had some of the first woolen mills, and you have to say to yourself, what the hell was a cotton mill doing in Cummington in 1812? I mean, cotton's growed way off down in some place in the Carolina that none of us ever get to see in our lifetime. and here we had a cotton mill in Cummington. So we had gone through our industrial revolution. We had a foundry, we had 4 woolen mill, we had 2 cotton mill, we had 4 tanneries, we had about 3 whetstone mills, and they all had pretty much died out by the time that the Cummington Creamery come along. So there was a complete evolution from the Industrial Revolution, and one of the main causes we still are the furthest state in the furthest town in the state of Massachusetts from a railhead. So if you're going to have something like paper mill here, or you're going to have something like woolen mill, there's no transportation out of the town, only over the Rock Mountain Hill. So, but the creamery was different. We could, you know, pounds of butter, you could get an awful lot of them, and it was the age of the peddlers. And so, you know, if you want to get the feel of the peddling of butter and milk and so on, go to the Kingman Tavern and see the Milton House delivery wagon.
Tell us a little more, if you can, about what happened to the products that were made here. Where did they go? How far? What direction?
Well, I think a lot went into Boston. That my research indicates to me that was at that period of time, or leading up to that period of time, Boston was more of our market than New York City. But soon after we begin to move towards the 20th century and so on, we picked up the New York market too. But I think most of the butter from here, I think in my books I state some of it was shipped to the big city like New York or Boston, but I think a lot of it was picked up right here at the creamery by these peddlers that peddled milk and eggs and butter and so on. And they went in 7 different directions from Cummington. We're very fortunate in Cummington. We're sort of like the hub of the wheel. We've got Northampton, Holyoke, we've got Westfield, we've got Dalton, Pittsfield, we've got Adams, North Adams, we've got Greenfield, and then we got Northampton, which is our county seat. So we had a market we could tap into quite easily. And I think I do a blurb in my volume 2 of my book about some of the peddlers up in West Cummington. It gives you a sort of overview of how important a milk peddler and egg peddler was. I think that was your distribution here. And you know, there was some trains and so on, 1860, but they were a long ways off. You know, they were a trolley car down through Northampton, a trolley to the train in Springfield and so on.
Right.
So,
how long did the Creamery Cooperative exist?
Well, it ran into the late 20s and early 30s. We sort of surmised that the modern automobile and truck did them in. In other words, you could transport your milk down to Northampton on a milk truck, and it would be bottled fresh and peddled out to the people in the city and so on. And my uncle, Franklin Streeter, had some of the first milk routes out of the town. I can remember them in the 1930s. We had 20-quart milk can then, and that was part of the evolution that we had to store the milk overnight after you milked it. And so the farmers in 1880, in cooperation with the creamery here, started putting in ice houses, and we started cutting ice in the 1980s. And that was an industry all unto itself. This same uncle of mine that transported the fresh milk down into the city also had the ice cutting contracts, or the ice cutting business, if you will. And there's a million stories you could tell about the ice cutting business from the 1880s. And The last ice that was cut in Cummington was 1945, and by that time some of the farmers were beginning to get electricity under Roosevelt electrical purification program. We didn't get it until 1947, but the gasoline motor would drive the same unit that electric motor would, so we were forced to put in coolers that were insulated and had engines driving the unit to cool the milk and so on.
And these were health regulations, government health regulations?
Just beginning to come in, yeah, and you know, we began to have milk inspectors in the 1940s. We didn't have milk inspector before that.
Bill, after the creamery as an actual dairy cooperative petered out, you said that was when, in the early...
In the late 20s and early 1930s.
What happened then to this property, this building that had been put up for this purpose? In the
Oh, that's an interesting little period. It was in limbo. First of all, the town of Cummington, we toyed with the idea of using it as a town garage. And so it was full of town trucks from probably about 1940, somewhere in there, give or take a little bit, until 1947. And when the town, for whatever reason, and I don't know the reason, found it wasn't quite what they would want for a town garage, a guy by the name of Vos out in Dalton purchased it. And he kept his school buses. He had the school route between Cummington and Dalton, and Pittsfield, taking us kids out that way, and he kept his school buses in there. I think about 1947, a chap by the name of Myers, I can't tell you his first name, I'd seen him, but I never knew him really. He bought it, and that was the first attempt to turn it into a commercial piece of property. He set up a sandwich bar, and he put in the first gas pumps. He run it 1947, 1948. And I came home 3.5 years later. I got extended because of the Korean War. And I came back 3.5 years in 1952. And the creamery was for sale. And I had saved up $2,200 in soldier's deposit while I was in Germany. Not much to spend it on, and I had had my full of drinking. I didn't need any more alcohol for the rest of my life. And so I came home, and Dad was very pleased. We boys, a lot of us came home at the same time. We were 6 of us in the family, 4 boys, and about 3 of us came home. So to put bread and butter on the table, that's when we really started the quarry up there, the flagstone up on the farm and so on. We had done flagstones all our lives up there, but we really cranked it up when us boys all came home. And so I came down and poked around at the creamery, and the Fontaines by that time had bought it from Myers and had moved the food operation into an official restaurant, and they had added a package store to it. And Mrs. Fontaine had had a slight stroke, and so they were anxious to sell the creamery, and I negotiated for it. They wanted $23,000. Each town had one, and maybe some two, whether well-to-do farmers or well-to-do merchants or commercial operator that would lend young people a second mortgage. And once you got a second mortgage, you could go to the bank, and generally the money lender would go to the bank with you and even co-sign. So you were sure, and the deal would go through. And so I got the mortgage, and I took over the restaurant, package store, and gas station. And You know, one of the first things you begin to realize that victuals and food don't go together.
What don't?
Victuals.
Oh, victuals.
Yeah, don't go together. So here you are in the middle of making a Western sandwich or pork chop dinner, and somebody's out there wanting gasoline. And so you go, yeah, it's help. And you don't have enough help, you can't afford enough help. So it was a terrible conflict. And I immediately, they were starting to put the new road in here, and I immediately getting very, very busy with the restaurant.
Up to this time, Route 9 was a curvy
Very much
main
so.
street.
It had been blacktopped.
Yes.
They blacktopped it in 1925. My mother tells about when she and Dad were courting each other, they were blacktopping the road between here, and she lived, I think, in Amherst then, and they were beginning to blacktop the roads, the back roads up here. And so I ran the restaurant about a year, and I catered to the road gang, and it was hell. You know, they'd get you up at 3 o'clock in the morning because they wanted to get going at 4 o'clock in the morning. And they wanted breakfast to be twice the size it should have been, you know, hungry as hell. And so I put up with it for about 18 months to 2 years catering to the road gang. And I thought up here and by that time I was a professional cook because I had been a mess sergeant in the Army, and I'd been to cook and baker school and so on, and I knew enough about it to get by. It was a lot different Army cooking than civilian cooking, but I knew enough to get by, and so I was completely burned out by the time the road was blacktop and so on, and so I thought to myself, to hell with this. I think I'll run a store. It must be a lot easier picking a damn can of tomato juice off the shelf and selling it to somebody, and it's going out and making a sandwich for them. And so, and I'll never forget, it was kind of in the middle of the winter, and on a Friday night I had everything lined up, and the last customer, always happens that way, lagged through until about 7:45 at night, and they left the restaurant, and I had 3 big trucks sitting outside, and I had a gang of about 8 people. We come in with sledgehammer and axes, and we loaded the restaurant all night long on the truck, and before daylight we dumped it into the dump up there. Nobody could see us. We dumped the whole restaurant in the dump. And I had bought out 2 stores down on Main Street, the general stores that were still existing. I had bought them out prior to the little plan I had, and so we went right down there. That was Friday night, and by Saturday morning we were sweeping and mopping the floor, ready to put the grocery store in. And we worked all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and all day Sunday. And Monday morning, had the meat counter all set up, and all the counters in and everything. And a couple that had lingered until 7:45 on Friday night was an elderly summer couple that lived in a little summer cottage down on Main Street and depended on the restaurant for their meals. And they come jogging up about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I can see them now. They stepped up onto the stoop out in front of the stair, and they opened the door, and it was a grocery store, not a restaurant. They backed up, and they looked down the street, and they looked up the street, and then they stepped back inside, and they looked, and they stepped back out, and they felt very certain they were in the wrong place. That was, I hadn't been to bed for 3 days and 3 nights. That was the icing on the cake, but to see that couple, I can see them today. And they were just searching. They were absolutely convinced that somehow or other they'd taken the wrong corner or something. And,
did they buy anything from you?
I tried to explain, but a lot of people just couldn't really savvy it in town what had happened.
Yeah, during these first incarnations as a commercial business, did this go under the name of the Creamery? Did people call it the Creamery informally?
The restaurant was called the Old Creamery Restaurant. And when I changed it that night to a grocery store, I called it Bill's Place.
Bill's Place.
I was probably as successful as I could be under the conditions. You know, I overexpanded very quickly, put in hardware. I had a full I liked hardware. I came off the farm, and I was a meat cutter, and we had a wonderful meat counter. And I spoke earlier that it was a very busy place between fall harvest, when you had the migrant worker, the immigrants come in and work the potato fields and any other harvest in the apples and so on, and couple that in with the we had 3 schools and with them students coming down. It was an unusual for a quiet little town like Cummington to have the activity in the summer months. And then literally we do pull up the sidewalk in the summertime, wintertime. I think it's a little bit different now, but the Creamery is very unusual. The Creamery has been able to carve out a niche, the present Creamery has carved out a niche all of its own. If I had my own niche between the schools and the migrant worker, the present Creamery, is my feeling anyhow, that their success lies in the fact of such good food. I mean, my wife and I down in the valley, we can't talk with anybody that say, well, we're going to have to go to Pittsfield or something. Oh, we've got to stop in the Creamery. Well, we always stop in the Creamery. You never can talk to anybody that they already know about the Creamery. So they carved out their niche. So, you know, half of life is being prosperous and leading that style of life. But the other half is the footprint you're going to leave. You know, if you don't leave any footprint, then there's not much object in going through life. And I feel that's very important, that the footprint you leave in the sand is nearly as important as how prosperous you was and so on. It takes a certain personality to run one of the places. Like I say, the present owners of the Creamery have carved out their niche. They know what the hell they're doing.
Well, just to wrap things up, Bill, with Bill Streeter, and talking about the history of the Creamery, and began in the 1800s as a dairy cooperative, and it's coming full circle, and soon will be a community-owned deli, grocery store, cooperatively owned and managed. And it's only fitting that Bill is member owner #1 of the Old Creamery Cooperative.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. And thanks to thank you, Rosemary Wessel, our videographer, and be signing off for now.